What's up, guys? It's Q&A time on December 31st, 2018. So a little New Year's Eve segment. Probably won't get this out till tomorrow, unless the wife keeps me up all night, and then I might get it out tonight in my attempt to stay up till midnight. Wish me luck. All right, so this segment was based around fat loss or contest prep. I am going to start on Facebook, it looks like. Okay, so here we go. First one is, what is the best option of T3 use in a prep? Here are 3 options I've heard spoken about. 1, use a replacement dose for the last 6 weeks. 2, use earlier in prep when calories are higher. 3, use for last 12 weeks or entire prep. This is assuming everything else is on point. Yada, yada, yada. Yeah, okay, so... well, ideally, we would know when is thyroid downregulated, and then you'd add it in then. But unless you're actually going in and getting lab work done, you're not going to know exactly when. It's just kind of a best educated guess. Now, I mean, if you're getting lab work done every 4 weeks in prep or something, which a lot of people aren't going to do that, it'd be really expensive. But if you were, yeah, I mean, you could pretty much pinpoint when you needed to manipulate your thyroid. So, first off, mention replacement dose. Yeah, that's a good idea. Just using a replacement dose. That's essentially all you're doing with exogenous thyroid anyhow, is you're replacing your endogenous production when it's downregulated. And then maybe you could go a little bit above replacement if you wanted, if you need a little extra boost. You don't want to be extremely hyperthyroid, and you obviously don't want to be hypothyroid either. And you could also argue that T4 with T3 is going to be more bioidentical to what the body's going to produce and utilize, so you might want to use both. Now, out of those 3 scenarios, I mean, there's not really a way for me to say exactly when, but normally when the body starts really fighting hard, that's normally a sign that there's some probably thyroid downregulation. Now, obviously, there's other hormones in play there, primarily like leptin, for example, is a fat loss hormone. That's going to be a big one that's in play. So you can't assume that it's just thyroid that's downregulated. Obviously, you have other things in play as well. So you have to make your best guess. But yeah, I wouldn't, it's one of those things with fat loss with your, tools in your toolbox. You don't necessarily want to use everything all at once. So if you could wait till a little later and add it in when things are really fighting hard, then that's probably your best bet. So that might be option 1 where it says 6 weeks. That's not to say that you couldn't use it for 12 weeks. You have someone that adapts really hard, really quickly. It could absolutely be added in earlier. I probably spoke about this before. Maybe I have, maybe I haven't. But the thyroid gland is very resilient in terms of recovery with the use of exogenous thyroid. That's not to say that you can't do any damage, but it's less likely than AAS or, using hormones. So, yeah. Okay. Sorry, that's my dog, obviously. Next one is discuss cryolipolysis. Okay, so first off, it just says discuss. I'm not exactly sure which elements he wants me to discuss, but off the top of my head, I do remember reading a study on this because I was genuinely just curious about it. I've seen the cool sculpting places, they're called cool sculpting here in the US, pop up in quite a few places, and that's actually what I found was that's actually FDA approved method here in the US of that cryolipolysis. So yeah, it is FDA approved. I found at least one study on it that I can remember that didn't find any adverse effects in terms of like damage to the skin, because it is exposing the skin to a cold temperature. So a lot of people were worried about, well, is it going to damage my skin, like scarring or burning or, you know, like frostbite type of concern. And the answer was no, there was no adverse effects. And I would imagine that was part of, you know, part of the stipulation of it getting FDA approved. It can't be like burning people's skin off. So, yeah, it is FDA approved tool here in the US for fat loss. Now, he says in the context of prep, my disclaimer is I have never had a client use it. I've never talked to anyone personally that's used it. I've read anecdotes. I've read people's before and afters. I have no idea which ones are like paid and, you know, advertisement or what the deal is. But it does seem plausible, at least. So essentially what it's doing is the fat cells in the area are more susceptible to cold. So essentially what's happening is you're freezing the area, more or less. It's causing an inflammatory response, and that's going to be that's going to cause an immune response. So certain cells, certain immune cells are going to attack the area, more or less, from the inflammatory response. It's kind of a drawn out process, but it should eventually metabolize or consume the lipid cells. So it's I guess you could say it's going to kill the fat cell, or at least empty the fat cell. I'm not sure, to be honest, if it's meant to actually kill the fat cell or just drain the fat cell. But yeah, that's essentially what's happening with something like cool sculpting. Now, the downside of it in a prep scenario was it is a drawn out process. From the study that I read, and there could be more studies, it took something like 3 to 4 weeks for the actual immune response to happen and can consume the fat cell, or at least they speculated. And it could be up to 3 months for the whole inflammatory response to dissipate. So that's a pretty long time. It could be something that you would want to do like maybe like a lot further out, maybe even in an off-season phase, or like towards the end of an off-season as you go into a prep, to maybe start you off in a better spot and you're not too worried about if you have an inflammatory response or not. Just my worry would be it would get really hard to gauge photos and stuff if you got this inflammation going on, especially like if you're doing it in your stomach or something. But yeah, seems plausible enough. No adverse effects. FDA approved. I'm not sure what the governing body is in the UK. The listener the viewer that's asking the question is from the UK, so I'm not really sure what their options are there. But we do have options here in the US. I have no idea what the pricing is. Maybe I'll have to try it. See what happens. If it's not too terribly expensive. Okay. Next is do you ever implement a cut during an improvement or off-season for a client? If so, what are some of the signs and factors that play into the decision? Do you have a visual or measurable limit on how much body fat you allow a client to add during this phase? Okay. So, no, there's not necessarily a limit, but what we want to look for is just a favorable ratio of lean body mass or muscle to fat gain. You know, if the person's gains 3 pounds deep into an off season, it looks like it's pretty much all fat on them, then they probably need to pull back. They're just not partitioning nutrients efficiently. If you were to check, which you should be, or you don't have to, but it's helpful. Like checking blood glucose, for example, they may be becoming insulin resistant. So those would be the signs. Checking for insulin resistance, which could be checking blood glucose, could also be like checking, are they getting good pumps in the gym anymore? Or are they not? Maybe they're not partitioning nutrients efficiently, which would result in the poor pump typically. What else am I looking at? yeah, the visual, like I said, I gave you the visual signs. The visual signs would just be a not a favorable ratio of muscle to fat gain. And you might have to do side-by-side photos occasionally in clients. I mean, some people do them a lot. I use them. I definitely use them in clients. I don't necessarily use them in an off-season week to week, because you're just not going to see a lot in most people, but I'll definitely use them. Anything else? Not really. That's just it. It's just you get a good eye for that, like I said, that ratio, that favorable ratio, and you can kind of spot when it's going south. And then you have the other factors like the side-by-side photos, and you have the other factors like the insulin resistance. You could even base it off hunger. Like if someone's miserably full all the time, that's maybe a sign that their body's fighting back as well. So those would be that's about as measurable as we are going to be able to get. Okay. Do you prefer low carbs, high fat, or high carbs, low fat in a prep? Second, when do you add in clen or T3 in the last weeks of contest prep, and at what dosage? The first question, I couldn't begin to answer that. It depends. That's definitely an it depends type of question. The high carbs, low fat, or low carbs, high fat, whatever the person feels best on. I mean, number one is we create a deficit. What the person feels and performs best on is probably going to be what I'm going to put them on, because they're going to have the best workouts. They're going to have the probably highest NEAT levels because they feel a little bit better. They're just going to have the best environment for success and best environment for fat loss. So, yeah. There's not like a certain type of person that's going to do better on one or the other. It's just one of those things where you have to get some feedback from people. It helps if you've worked with them previously. It helps if they've had previous fat loss phases they can give you feedback on. I mean, all that stuff helps. And then you can kind of put it all together and make your best educated guess. And then you can always call an audible later. Like I've had scenarios where I've had people on like a ketogenic type diet, and they just weren't doing good on it. They just felt like shit, and I didn't think they should feel that way yet. Like, they weren't at that point in the prep, and I kind of ruled out as many variables as I could in terms of like nutrient deficiencies and thyroid and hormones and all those things. They were all very constant. So I just flipped the macros, basically kept calories the same, and took the fats way down and brought the carbs up, and it worked. And I've done the opposite. I've taken carbs down and fats up, switch into like a ketogenic scenario. So yeah, it's what they feel best on for sure. And then second, when do you add clen or T3? Well, I answered the T3 part in the first question, so make sure you reference back to question 1. I went over that already. And the clen, it's kind of the same. It's not thyroid related. There's not a clen receptor or like we don't produce endogenous clenbuterol, so you can't like measure it. But it's one of those things where, yeah, you want to try to save some tools for later and, deeper into the prep when you need them. If someone's progressing great without using anything, then just keep going with it and don't just add it in. Save it for when you need it. Save it for when it's going to work the best. So that could be 6 weeks, 8 weeks, even 10 weeks. And if someone's going to use it earlier in a prep for a longer duration, then probably going to start low, or maybe not even start every day. Something like using a supplement that hits alpha receptors like yohimbine would be the main one, and using that on rotating basis with clen for beta receptors. So you're not just hammering the same supplement each day, especially, like I said, if it's really far out in prep. So if it's like 12 weeks, or you're going to add something in as early as 16 weeks out or something like that, you probably don't want to necessarily go straight to 100 micrograms of clen like right off the rip for 16 weeks straight. Now you could, does not desensitize like people say. Some people say it desensitizes. That myth has been more or less debunked. So, yeah, I mean, you technically could. It's just I would want to save it for when it's needed most. And dosages, yeah, earlier in prep, probably going to start a lower dosage. Later in prep, you're going to ramp it up a little bit quicker. 100, 120 is normally pretty much max for most people. Some people do go higher. Normally don't like to, unless I have to. So, next one, let's have a couple more. 2 more, looks like. Importance of correct thyroid function for fat loss. If it is incorrectly functioning, how would this affect fat loss? And then, well, the next one's thyroid related too. So lots of thyroid questions, which is fine. As someone is dieting down, do you look at someone's TSH over T3, T4 more so, or vice versa? Ideally, what would you like to see clients' TSH be at during prep phase? I assume lower TSH typically means the body is producing enough T3, T4. Okay, so I'll just kind of knock both of those out as one. Yeah, the importance of thyroid function, yeah, it's vastly important. It's one of the primary metabolic systems, I guess, in your body. Like I mentioned earlier, there is other hormones, there are other hormones at play, leptin especially. So I wouldn't say that it's like the end all be all. Like for example, you'll get people that use exogenous thyroid and they think, okay, I'm using 100 or 150 micrograms of T4 and 50 micrograms of T3. Why is my metabolism stalling? It shouldn't, because I'm replacing I'm replacing my endogenous thyroid with exogenous, and it can't go down when you are supplementing with it. Kind of like testosterone, it can't go down if you're introducing it synthetically. But what they fail to realize is that there are other hormones at play and there are other mechanisms at play, leptin primarily, like I talked about, being lowered. So that's where things like refeeding properly and stuff come into play. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely hugely important. Now, it would slow, yeah, how would it affect fat loss? Well, it would definitely slow fat loss for sure. Now, your body can compensate for this for a little while. So they mentioned TSH. TSH will rise in response to the body needing to produce more endogenous thyroid hormone. It will be able to compensate for a little while. So you would typically see it in kind of phases where first TSH goes up. That's your body responding to needing to produce more thyroid hormone. Then it does produce more thyroid hormone. And it can keep up with that for a little bit, but eventually it's going to kind of get burnt out. The thyroid gland is going to get burnt out. And even though it's producing more TSH, it's not able to keep up with the demand of T4 and then, in conversion to T3. So it's going to the thyroid gland is going to kind of peter out at that point. Now, it's not going to happen right away, but it's going to happen eventually. So we could look at TSH as like a warning sign. Now, you'll notice that people do have high TSH that have poor T3 and T4 levels, but they probably, before they ever had the low T3 and T4 levels, they probably already had high TSH. It was like the warning sign that was there. So if you were to catch it, like if you were to do lab work and see TSH is high, then that's maybe a warning sign that you need to manipulate thyroid, or at least be cautious of what you're doing, or whatever, depending on what your plan is. But what would be a good level of TSH? There's kind of a functional range, like they call it. It's called a functional range. It's argued what this is. I posted about it. I've heard different opinions about it. Probably somewhere in like the 1.0 to 2.5 maybe. I've seen some people say higher, and I've seen people say lower, like you don't want to go over 2.0. But probably somewhere in that 1.0 to 2.5 range, give or take 0.5 maybe, if you want to bring that 2.5 down to 2. So, and some people will say, I've heard a really aggressive, like, let's not go over 1.5, which lots of people, healthy people, I think, go over 1.5. So, That's a pretty aggressive goal. But yeah, so that, like I said, that would be kind of your warning sign. And that would be where I would like to see most of the clients' TSH. They said, I assume lower TSH typically means the body is producing enough T3 and T4. The answer would probably be yes. Not always, but usually. You could always check those, those thyroid hormones. Rarely would I suggest just checking TSH by itself. You would want to check T3 and T4 and potentially reverse T3, and if you suspect some kind of autoimmune issue, then possibly antibodies. But yeah, so that's kind of the order of events: the TSH going up, and then the T3 and T4 eventually going down because your body can't keep up with demand. So, yep, that's it. I hope that explains that. I know that was a mouthful. But that's all the questions for this week, guys. I hope everyone has a happy New Year's, and I will talk to you in 2019.